Welcome back. You're watching Four Corners. The International Herald Tribune published an article today quoting the Associated Press titled U.S. State-Sponsored of Terrorism List Used for Political Purposes. Now, the article starts by saying that North Korea has not been linked to a terrorist attack in more than 2 decades, but is still on the U.S.'s list of state-sponsored terrorist nations. That in New York, Mr. Kevin Sanders, Director of War and Peace Foundation. How important is all of this?
Well, it's important that these very influential news organizations are drawing attention to something which is not new. In fact, what they're talking about has really been the case from the very beginning. The whole terrorist list from the very outset has been riddled with inconsistencies and hypocrisies, not just for all of the people that they've put on, but the absurdity of the list it becomes obvious if you look at some of the people, for example, who should have been on that list. Go back to the early days of the list. It is interesting, for example, that one of the most starkly obvious examples of state-sponsored terrorism was the French attack on the Greenpeace boat in New Zealand, the Rainbow Warrior. It was moored in New Zealand, and it had been taking part in trying to protest the nuclear testing that France was then conducting in the Pacific. And as it was later learned, the French government actually sent a team to blow up the Rainbow Warrior, which it did. A team of frogmen went there. I think there were 3 or 4 of them. They went there at night. They blew the Rainbow Warrior up, killing one of the crew, and they were actually caught by the New Zealand police. And they were hauled up before court. They ended up in jail. And France finally reluctantly admitted that, yes, they had approved it. It was, in fact, an overt, incontestable act of nation-state terrorism. At no stage was France is ever mentioned on any of the terrorist lists.
Mr. Sanders, let me continue with you. Amnesty International also published its latest report on human rights and has criticized the U.S. for its ongoing violations, notably in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, ironically enough, in Cuba, and in jails and prisons in U.S. mainland as well. Then we have issues like racial disparities by police discrimination, discrimination against women, and negligence of housing rights for the victims of Hurricane Katrina, as thousands of evacuees still remain displaced. And the big question I'm sure you remember after 9/11 and the so-called war on terror that was always asked was, is America a safer place? Is it a safer place for the average American citizen? Do you think that America is a safe place?
No, I don't think it is a safer place than it was before 9/11, and I'm not sure it is more dangerous. I don't think a great deal has changed. The United States has policies which invite resistance, resentment, and retaliation, and have for 20, 30 years. Ever since World War II, America has been sort of throwing its weight around, particularly in those parts of the world in which there is a strong Islamic element. And the resistance, the hostility to the United States is inescapable and understandable and justified. And some of the cases that you have just mentioned are examples. And as a result, so long as the United States continues to adhere to these policies, America will be in danger. On the other hand, I think equally quickly it might be that the United States, if it changes its behavior, as it most certainly will if there is a new administration, and particularly if it is an administration headed by Barack Obama, I think dramatic changes will take place, and I think that after that point, it is quite possible that America will quite quickly become a much safer place. And again, the idea of a war on terror is an inanity, a dangerous absurdity, a terrifying error of grammar, as it were. You cannot have a war on terror. Terror is a tactic. It doesn't involve armies or uniforms or agreements or or surrenders in any traditional sense. And so to act as though you can have a war on terror is absurd and is doomed to failure, as the war on drugs. It needs to be rethought. The whole terrain, the whole set of assumptions need to be re-examined, and that is why I am as enthusiastic as I admit I am, that this will change, particularly under an Obama leadership, because he has spoken many times of the need to rethink the whole structure of American foreign policy, and not always to think in terms of war or military response to situations that require entirely different approaches. I think there will be such a different approach under any Democrat, and particularly with Obama.
One analyst I was speaking to earlier said that perhaps the United States uses human rights issues as a political tool because it wants to cover up its own issues. Do you think that's the case?
I think that is the case. It's true of many, if not most, nations, but is most conspicuously so with the United States, because the United States is so big and so powerful and so omnipresent in its great imperial reach around the world that it is under the closest scrutiny, and rightly so. And under the years of the Bush administration, it has become much more aggressive, much more intrusive, much more dangerous in its policies. And so I think, therefore, so much traces to the leadership in the United States. And that is why a change of leadership could obviate many of the problems that we're discussing here now. But right now, unfortunately, the United States is in the hands of an administration which has run amok, which has failed dramatically, which has caused all sorts of problems that it never intended to, and now it is still theoretically possible that Bush has still got enough time to blow up the world if he wants to. But I think that the sort of reports that are coming out, and the one that you've just quoted, will be helpful to some extent in quelling the rush to the kind of policies that Bush has been following. America has been more than usually abusive in the last 8 years or so, and to say that all nations should do more and could do more, yes, but there are some nations. I would offer, for example, right now, Norway. Norway leads the world in the most enlightened, thoughtful, important policies on energy, on human rights, on the generosity that it displays in helping the third world. The United States, for all its riches, in terms of per capita devoted to helping the rest of the world, is very low. America always boasts that we are the most generous nation in the world. Actually, America is not. Nor is it the leader of the free world. As in fact, to quote Osama bin Laden in one of his speeches, he said, George Bush is wrong. We do not hate America because of its freedoms. If it were freedoms that we hated, we would attack Sweden. Because indeed, he points out correctly, Sweden and many other nations are much freer than the United States. The United States has more people behind bars per capita than any other country in the Western world, more than China. And so the idea that this is the freest and most generous nation in the world offering spiritual and moral leadership is misplaced. It's not true.